Thank you so much. Man, it is great to be here at MCC Feszt. And it is a pleasure to be here in Hungary, especially now that I am officially a Hungarian author. That is not something that I ever expected to be. I'm ashamed to say that I do not know a single word of Hungarian. But fortunately, when it comes to the new translation of my first book, that is not a problem. My book, Reasons to Vote for Democrats, I won't even try to pronounce the Hungarian title, that might be the first book in history for which the translation is nearly identical to the original release. There was one change in the Hungarian translation. Because of the difference in American and Hungarian political parties, the title here has been changed from Reasons to Vote for Democrats to Why Vote for Liberals. Because the Conservative Party here in Hungary, just as in America, is not opposed to democracy. On the contrary, the conservatives in our respective countries are far more supportive of democracy and proper political representation for the people than are our political opponents. This is one of the stranger features of news reports about Hungarian politics in the international press. I remember reading about the Hungarian elections of 2018. The people voted for your Conservative Party and your excellent Prime Minister, Mr. Orbán. And the international press reported the election as a threat to democracy. The New York Times reported, quote, "Hungary's democracy is in danger." Euronews warned of a real threat to democracy in Hungary. You can hear the bells tolling for democracy behind me. Vox.com went even further with the headline, "How Democracy Died in Hungary." And how exactly did democracy supposedly die in Hungary? Well, according to the liberal press, it's because the people voted for someone that the press did not like. That struck me as a rather strange way for democracy to die, by allowing the people to have their voices heard. But when the liberal press, when the liberal establishment in Brussels and elsewhere around the world, when they talk about democracy, they don't really mean democracy. They mean liberalism, which has always been distinct from democracy and increasingly is at odds with it, as the people of Hungary, Poland, Italy, the United Kingdom, my own country, the United States, and now Spain and others I'm sure to follow, are rejecting the failed rule of a globalist liberal elite that has squandered our respective nations' resources and treated our citizens with contempt. Populism, people, that is, threaten government by the people, somehow, according to the liberals, and so the people, they say, must be quashed. But the people around the West have said no. We've said no in different ways. In my country, we said no through the election of Donald Trump. In the UK, the Brits said no through the Brexit. And in Hungary, you have said no in broader, subtler, and perhaps even more enduring ways. Hungary has said no by consciously and consistently working to rebuild liberalism's sworn enemy, the family. The liberals have levied all sorts of vague and preposterous attacks on Hungarian conservatives in recent years. But even the liberals can't dispute one particularly conspicuous achievement, which is Hungary's unique success at beginning to reverse the decades-long trend of demographic decline. And how have you done it? By supporting families. You've provided financial and political support for people to get married and have babies. You've provided more support the more babies people have. You've taken steps to protect babies in the womb. You've prioritized the good of your citizens over the desires of foreigners beyond your borders. You've defined what marriage is and always will be and defended that institution. That's just common sense. I'm not saying that it has been easy. I'm sure it has not been easy. But it is simple enough. Egghead masters of the universe in far distant capitals would have us all believe that statecraft is too complex for ordinary patriots to understand. But politics, it turns out, is not rocket science, no matter what the liberal technocrats would have us believe. This pro-family, pro-people policy did not arise in opposition to a neutral political order. It arose in opposition to an intentional liberal campaign to destroy the family, a powerful and long-lasting political campaign to destroy the family by redefining marriage out of existence, discouraging and delaying marriage for those who still seek it, promoting contraception and Planned Parenthood for married couples, subsidizing the destruction of babies through abortion, reducing the ability of families to educate and raise their children as they see fit, and establishing an economic order that makes it ever more difficult for families to pay for their basic needs. The liberal order pretends to be neutral, but it is not. Just like all regimes, liberalism incentivizes certain behaviors and discourages others. In the social sphere, liberalism encourages ever more disordered and deviant habits, most notably of late in the sexual realm, justified by an ever-degrading definition of individual freedom. In the economic sphere, liberalism encourages ever more selfish habits of production and consumption, which so radically reject the notion of a common good that they leave as an inheritance to successive generations little more than mounting piles of debt. Normal people throughout the West are waking up to the reality that what we were told would make us free has actually enslaved us. Of course it did, because the liberal conception of freedom directly contradicts the classical and Christian understanding of freedom that built our civilization. Liberty, it turns out, is not the ability to do what we wish, but the right to do what we ought. In recent decades, the West has fallen for the false freedom of the addict. I know Hungary understands this fact. While countries around the West are rushing to legalize all sorts of drugs, from the Peruvian parsley, the old devil's lettuce, all the way up to the harder stuff, Hungary has held the line on drugs. As well, you should. Drugs are the perfect way to understand how the liberal conception of liberty goes so wrong. The liberal view is that liberty is nothing more than the ability to do whatever you want whenever you want to do it. According to this view, a heroin addict in an alleyway in Amsterdam is the freest man in the world. As long as he's got a couple bucks in his pocket, as long as he's got a place to shoot dope without fear of being arrested, then that man is the pinnacle of freedom, right? I don't think so. Of course not. The heroin addict is not the freest man in the world. He's a slave. He's a slave to his appetites. He's a slave to his addiction. He couldn't stop himself from shooting up, even if he wanted to. This is why our Lord tells us that the man who sins is a slave to sin. He tells us that if we are to be free, we must take his yoke upon us. Unlike the yoke of sin, the wages of which are death, the yoke of Christ, of truth and goodness himself, is easy and the burden is light. But it is a yoke. This is what St. Paul means when he tells us that we can be slaves either to sin or to righteousness. And crucially, this is what he is describing when he laments that the things that he wants to do, he does not do, and the things that he doesn't want to do, he does. Modern liberalism, for all of its incessant blather about free will, fails to grasp the defining feature of the will, which is that it is split in two. We have a lower will, which is the appetite, and a higher will, the rational will, traditionally understood to mediate between the appetite and the divine will. The lower will tells us that we want to eat that third dessert. The rational will tells us to put the cupcake down because we will regret having eaten it later. And our appetites, by the way, are not fixed in stone. If we give free rein to our basest passions and desires, they will become more and more pronounced to the point that our rational will won't be able to exert much control over them at all. That's the heroin addict. But if we follow our rational will and discipline our appetites, soon enough our desires will change. Soon we won't have quite so strong an affection for that third cupcake. Soon we won't have so strong a desire for things that are liable to harm us. Soon enough, we might even begin to develop tastes and appetites for things that are actually good for us. This is, in theory, the purpose of a liberal education. Liberal in the classical sense, not the bad sense, the classical sense, which is literally training in freedom, the type of education that befits free men. I say in theory because today, college does precisely the opposite. Today, it's a 4-year bacchanal at best, and at worst, it's an initiation ritual into a cult of absurdities designed to stamp out the last shreds of common sense that a student might possess. The modern university is failing to train students in the virtues that will help to make them free. The modern university primarily trains students in vices that will keep them ignorant and enslaved. Often, these schools will actively teach things that are not true about human nature, about history, about philosophy and biology and everything in between. A prominent politician with 2 degrees from Harvard recently proved herself incapable of defining the word woman. Any ordinary person on the street can tell you the meaning of the word woman. It takes 2 degrees from Harvard to be confused about what a woman is. Sometimes the universities actively teach falsehoods. The notion, for instance, that men can really be women, or the notion that mankind is on the brink of extinction thanks to the sun monster, or whatever they're saying now. More often, though, the universities maleducate students through the supposedly passive posture of liberalism. More often, the universities will impede students from pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful by convincing them that the good, the true, and the beautiful don't really exist, or at the very least, that the good, the true, and the beautiful cannot be ascertained through our frail faculties of reason and moral judgment. But the end result of this subtler form of liberal indoctrination is much the same as more activist left-wing brainwashing. In both cases, students remain ignorant of, indifferent to, and even outright hostile toward the virtues most conducive to our flourishing. The liberals of a bygone era recognized the dead end of such radical skepticism. Charles Seymour, the liberal former president of Yale, famously acknowledged that skepticism has utility only when it leads to conviction. Today, however, even many putative conservatives embrace this kind of radical skepticism that denies the possibility of ever really knowing anything for certain. And so these self-styled conservatives exalt procedural norms as though they were substantive goods. In recent years, conservatives have heaved high the mantle of academic freedom, diversity of thought, freedom of speech, as though they were ends in themselves, without ever once remembering that none of those slogans has ever really existed in practice, because all schools must teach something. All thinkers must come to some conclusions, and the right to speak in the abstract means nothing to people who have nothing to say. So what are we going to say and believe and teach and do? The answer cannot be everything, just as it cannot be nothing. All societies, for all of history, have had some standards, norms, and taboos. All cultures perform rituals. All people worship something. As the great political philosopher Bob Dylan once observed, everybody's got to serve somebody. The words cult and culture derive from the same root word, at least in my language. I've told you I've given up trying to learn Hungarian, but at least in my language and in the Romance languages, they come from the same root word. What a culture worships will define that culture. A culture that worships money will be materialistic. A culture that worships sex will be licentious. A culture that worships God will be godlier. So what does liberal culture worship? Liberal culture worships the self. At every turn, liberalism insists that we prioritize the self in all its subjectivity over every other consideration. When reality says that you're a man, but you yourself say that you're a woman, well, we must defer to you, to self-conception. When you conceive a child but decide for whatever reason that you don't want the baby, well, you must be given free rein to do whatever monstrous act you see fit. When you no longer like your spouse, to whom you vowed a lifelong commitment, well, you must go on and get a divorce. Parents getting old, stick them in a home. Don't care for your nation? That's fine. Who needs a nation? Who needs patriotism? You don't owe anything to your country, so they say. Whatever liberalism meant half a century ago, during, say, the American presidency of John F. Kennedy, it does not mean that today. Today, liberalism mocks the notion that you might ask what you can do for your country. Today, liberalism impels its adherents to ask only what your country can do for you. It's all the individual, all the way down. And a man wrapped up in himself makes a small package indeed. This, I think, is why you Hungarians, why nothing that you have done has so shocked and irked the liberals throughout the West quite so much as your family policy. Both progressives on the left and libertarians on the right have attacked Hungary's family policy alternately as anti-feminist and as anti-laissez-faire capitalist. And in fairness, I guess they're both right. The family policy, by rewarding families, undermines feminism, which opposes family. The policy is anything but laissez-faire. It takes a hands-on approach toward achieving a clearly defined social end. But of course, as we've already discussed, supposedly laissez-faire liberalism is also a lot more hands-on than the liberals would like to admit. While other nations throughout the West have adopted liberal policies that make society more individualistic, so successfully that those nations are now all literally dying and rely on mass migration to keep their economies afloat, Hungary has implemented a policy to make society more family-focused. What appears on the surface to be a tactical disagreement about how to tinker with public policy to achieve the outcomes that we all desire, in fact represents a fundamental philosophical disagreement over the basic structure and purpose of politics. For liberals, the basic unit of politics is the individual. For conservatives, the fundamental political unit is the family. For liberals, man is an atom. For conservatives, man is the political animal. For liberals, then, the purpose of politics is to maximize man's individual autonomy. For conservatives, it is to enable and encourage man's flourishing in accord with his nature, which is intrinsically social. It is no surprise, then, that the effect of liberal government has been to alienate citizens from virtually all bonds, and especially from unchosen bonds, bonds to country, to family, even, believe it or not, to ourselves. It might have sounded absurd even 5 or 10 years ago, but so corrosive is the acidic ideology of liberalism that it has in recent years even managed to separate individuals from their own bodies. The transgender ideology did not arise out of thin air. Transgender identity, the incidence of which has doubled and even tripled among young people in recent years, is the apotheosis of liberalism, a liberation so perfect that it purports to rend body from soul. What is the transgender transition? The transgender transition is a ritual suicide through which the old self is killed. The old self comes to be referred to literally as a dead name. Then, through the denial of one's body, one's heretofore hidden, supposedly true self is given a new life. But because one cannot actually split body from soul, because man is a hylomorphic and, in this world, inseparable unity of body and soul, the allegedly new person is really nothing more than a macabre mutilation of the inescapable self, a grotesque caricature of the opposite sex carved by disturbed individuals whose political community has failed to help them flourish and instead cruelly cheered on their destructive fantasies. This ideology, which until very recently found quarter only at the fringes of society, now threatens to colonize far more territory, left unchecked, it will colonize all of society, all the way down to little children. I got in some hot water recently with the liberal media when I spoke at the CPAC Political Action Conference and lamented the absurdity that even conservatives were debating if we ought to trans the 7-year-olds or if we ought to wait until they turn 8 to turn them transgender. Conservatives had ceded so much ground that even the very best conservative politicians were willing to tolerate transgenderism, even the transing of minors, so long as they were in the 4th grade rather than the 3rd. That was supposedly conservative. I pointed out that unlike with other political issues, when it comes to a basic philosophical matter, anthropological matter, such as transgenderism, there can be no conciliatory middle ground. Either men can secretly be women, or they can't. Either our bodies have something to do with our identity, or they don't. Either transgenderism is true, or it isn't. If it's true, then we ought to provide gender-affirming care, or whatever the quacks are calling it these days, to everyone, including and especially to little kids, who are at risk of, in the words of the liberals, going through the wrong puberty. But if transgenderism is false, as it obviously is, then it's false for everybody too. And if it's false, then we shouldn't tolerate it for anyone, because living according to lies is always destructive. If it is false, as it is, then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to that confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely, the whole preposterous ideology at every level. That statement got me in a little bit of trouble with the liberals, just a little tiny bit. It got me in so much trouble that they had to lie about what I said. The liberal media ran headlines accusing me of calling for genocide. Imagine my surprise when I read those headlines. I thought, I'm not really a genocide kind of guy. I never suspected to read that. But I read that because I said that we ought to stop pretending that girls can be boys. The newspaper's lawyers, I suspect, eventually forced them to change their libelous headlines. But why did they feel the need to lie in the first place? For starters, because they couldn't refute my argument. Also, they understood that the unraveling of the transgender issue as the apotheosis of liberalism could lead to the unraveling of the whole liberal ideology. In my own country, we are beginning to see this happen. A recent Gallup poll showed that as the American people have come out strongly against transing the kids, they've also once again begun to oppose earlier stages of the sexual revolution. In recent years, not only has the percentage of Americans who believe in transgenderism dropped significantly, but the number of Americans who approve of same-sex sexual relations of any kind has plummeted a full 7 percentage points. The reason is that, just as people understand that ideas have consequences, so too, people understand that bad consequences must come from bad ideas. And if transgenderism is false, then the idea undergirding transgenderism, the notion that men and women are basically the same, so much so that one can really become the other, that must be false too. And since that idea also undergirds the redefinition of marriage, the sexual revolution, feminism, one might even say liberalism itself, then when the people turn against one instantiation of that idea, they are likely to turn against all of them, as we are seeing more clearly each and every day. Your country has completed this process more quickly than any other. Your country has explicitly turned against liberalism. In 2014, your prime minister declared that Hungary would be an illiberal democracy. Since the middle of the 20th century, liberals have referred to all Western nations as liberal democracies. But however much the liberals would like to rewrite history, they're very fond of that, that term represents an historical break. Before the middle of the 20th century, the term liberal democracy appeared pretty much nowhere in literature, as even a simple n-gram search, at least in English, will reveal. Until the middle of the 20th century, about a half century earlier in Europe, Western countries understood themselves not as liberal democracies, but as Christian nations. And so when your prime minister declared Hungary an illiberal democracy, his statement reflected not a break with history, but a return to the Western tradition. A few years later, your prime minister followed this idea even further and declared Hungary a Christian democracy. As it must be, no nation can be merely the antithesis of something. Just as the soul animates the body, so too some spirit must animate the nation. And the spirit of Hungary today is Christian. Liberals around the world have attacked your leader as cynical and your people as hypocritical for calling yourselves Christian. Hypocritical, they say, because while 80 or 85% of Hungarians call themselves Christian, only 15% or so regularly attend church. Okay. First, I think that after the imposition of atheist communism for nearly half a century, people might be forgiven for taking a moment or two to get back in the swing of things. Rome wasn't built in a day. But furthermore, as La Rochefoucauld observed, hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. Liberalism and its offshoots have inculcated their vices into Westerners for a long time now. Even after we recognize a problem with our intellect, even after we repent and convert and decide to follow another course, the flesh is slow to follow. It takes long, hard work and ample grace to discipline our will to pursue what we know in our hearts and our minds is right. That is not hypocrisy. That is man's pilgrimage in a fallen world. But of course, the liberals deny the significance of the flesh. Their favorite ideological fad today is the notion that our bodies have nothing to do with who we really are. Even before transgenderism, the liberals argued that a nation's people has nothing to do with the nation. They argued that Western nations are not physical places with actual people, but merely ideas, that they would remain exactly the same, even if we threw open our borders and replaced all of our people with foreigners. It's the same conceit. We see it everywhere. In the liberals' hideous art and drab architecture, the idea that physical places don't matter. In the recent promotion of surrogacy, the idea that particular bodies don't matter, that they're interchangeable. Increasingly, we see it in the promotion of virtual reality, the metaverse, the notion that we ought to stop walking around the big, beautiful, ornate world that God made for us and instead live our lives inside a video game built by Mark Zuckerberg. Doesn't seem like a good trade to me. Apparently, it doesn't sound like a good trade to you either. For at least a decade now, Hungary has recognized that the conflict of our age is not merely a clash of ideas, but a battle over whether anything matters beyond ideas. Borders, traditions, rituals, people, flesh. Here, too, we see not a break, but a return to the deepest wisdom of our civilization. Here we are reminded of the wisdom of that ancient Christian writer, Tertullian, who understood that the flesh is the very condition on which salvation hinges. And since the soul is, in consequence of its salvation, chosen for the service of God, it is the flesh which actually renders it capable of such service. We are not free-floating spirits immune to decay. We are soul and body, living in a civilization animated by a religion that sees the incarnation as the very pivot and meaning of history. Prime Minister Orbán recently observed that Europe can only be saved if it returns to the source of its real values, its Christian identity. A century ago, the Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc declared even more provocatively that the faith is Europe, Europe is the faith. Not, I think, to restrict Christianity, which is impossible, but to underscore the importance of what real people do in real places to the religion that worships the living God who took on flesh and entered history to redeem us. People such as yourselves, in places such as Hungary, and with any luck, soon the whole West, which after a long enough period of decadence and decay has begun to recognize that the spirit which gave our civilization life remains the only spirit that can save us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.